You may have arrived here out of curiosity, or perhaps because something ancient stirred inside you when you heard the word empath. If that word called to something in you, know this: we are not here to speak merely of sensitivities or sentimentality. We gather for something far older. We are here to awaken the ancient rhythms that stir beneath what the modern mind too quickly labels as feelings. When I speak of the empath, I do not speak of a kind soul who simply senses what others feel. I speak of a conduit, a psychic lightning rod through which the unconscious of the world flows. And let me be clear, this is not always a blessing. Empathy, as celebrated in popular culture, is often a diluted version of the truth. When something becomes widely accepted, it's usually because its true power has been softened, made safe for consumption. The empath I have met through dreams, through deep listening, through archetypal descent, is not a smiling spiritual figure. No, the true empath is a bearer of weight, a silent carrier of shadows that do not belong to them, and most of the time they have no idea what has possessed them. To truly understand this, we must look deeper beneath the personal and even beneath the relational. The empath is not merely emotionally attuned. They are unconsciously open to the archetypal energies that move through others. Picture a village healer in an age of storms, kneeling in a field, vomiting blood. Not from illness, but because the land itself is wounded. That is the empath. They transmute suffering that is not their own. They feel burdens they were never meant to carry, and unless they become aware of this sacred function, they will be devoured by it. Once, in a dream I had before I could name what archetypes even were, I saw a woman standing on a bridge above a chasm. Her eyes were absent, her hands stretched forward trembling, both reaching for help and pushing something away. Beneath her, in the dark, voices cried out, lost, longing, desperate. She could not see them, but she could feel every cry, and her body bore their pain like an open wound. That woman is the empath. Her blindness is not physical. It is symbolic, a blindness to the origin of her pain. She cannot tell where the voices end and where she begins. She is a psychic sponge, but no one has ever taught her how to wring herself out. To be an open vessel without wisdom is dangerous. The unconscious does not care for morality. It is both sacred and chaotic. When the empath opens themselves to another, whether out of kindness or out of unconscious permeability, they absorb that person's shadow, the unprocessed debris of their soul. And most people walk through life dragging long shadows, unseen, unloved, untouched. What is unloved in one person often seeks refuge in another, and the empath, if not guarded, becomes that refuge. There is a tale from African tribal lore. A young dreamer wandered near the forest's edge, where nameless spirits whispered, not in words, but in sudden rushes of feeling, terror, grief, yearning. The dreamer began to weep without cause, to tremble without reason, to laugh in stillness. The tribe feared possession and summoned the elder, but the elder did not banish the spirits. He taught the dreamer to speak to them, to name them. That is the lesson I offer to you now. To be an empath without discernment is to become a playground for disowned archetypes. But to be an empath who names what they carry, that is the path of the alchemist. You may think it's enough to say, I feel what others feel. But that is only the beginning. Ask yourself, why do I feel this? Where does it enter me? What am I doing with it? Because empathy can become a subtle form of possession. The unconscious does not always arrive with horns and fire. Sometimes it comes dressed as overwhelming compassion, so great it drowns you. Sometimes it appears as an obsessive need to help, a need so intense it collapses your own boundaries. Sometimes it wears the face of love, love for someone whose shadow has mistaken your soul for a grave. I have seen empaths fall for those who are quietly destroying them, not because they are weak, but because they are drawn to pain. They feel the ache, and in feeling it, they become the caretaker, the savior, the sponge. But this is not salvation. It is a sacred entanglement, what I call enantiodromia, the reversal into the opposite. The healer becomes the harmed, the bearer of light becomes the host of shadow, and the longer this hidden exchange continues, the more the empath forgets who they really are. If you identify as an empath, you must understand your gift is not merely emotional, it is psychic, it is archetypal. You are not just attuned to moods, you are tuned into the mythic undercurrents of humanity itself. When someone enters your field, you sense not only their words or their smiles, you sense their lineage, their gods, their unlived lives, and unless you've made contact with your own unconscious, unless you've descended into the underworld of your own psyche, you will be overwhelmed by theirs. In the spiritual world, sensitivity is often worn like a badge, but in the world of the soul, no gift is pure light. Every light casts a shadow, and empathy perhaps more than any other. Do you know what happens to rage that has been silenced for years? It doesn't disappear, it waits, it lurks, it lives in the field, and when such a person meets an empath, especially one who is unaware of their own buried rage, that rage leaps like flame into dry wood. The empath ignites, overwhelmed, and doesn't know why. I once worked with a woman who cried every time she entered my office. Her tears came before words. She believed it was her heartbreak, her trauma, her parents, her lovers. And yes, there were wounds, but over months of deep work we found something else. She was carrying the ungrieved sorrow of her mother and her grandmother and all the women in her lineage who were forbidden to weep. She had become the vessel for a generational shadow, and in carrying their sorrow, she had forgotten how to feel her own. Empaths, if you do not separate what is yours from what is not, you will drown in a sea of nameless ghosts. The gift of feeling is sacred, but sacredness requires structure. A vessel must hold, otherwise the fire consumes it. Let me tell you another dream. A man walks through a cathedral made of mirrors. Each footstep echoes with unfamiliar voices. He turns to face a mirror, expecting his reflection, but in it he sees a child weeping. Another mirror, he sees a screaming soldier. Another, a dying mother. All these faces stare back, but none are his. He cries out, "Which one is me?" But the mirrors give no answer. They only reflect. This, too, is the path of the empath, lost in the mirrored pain of others, forgetting the face they once called their own. If any of this speaks to your soul, then ask, what have I done to truly know myself, not through labels, not through borrowed words, but in the crucible of confrontation? Have you descended into your own shadow? Have you asked whether your empathy is also a need? To feel holy, important, needed. Have you looked at the quiet pleasure that arises from being the only one who understands someone else's pain? Yes. Even the empath carries shadow motives. Sometimes helping others is a clever way to avoid meeting yourself. Sometimes carrying the pain of others feels easier than sitting in the silence of your own. We are strange creatures. We dress our avoidance in virtue, and the unconscious, always subtle, smiles behind the mask. Empathy is not salvation. It is a doorway. To walk through it wisely, you must master the art of boundaries. Not the walls of fear, but the skin of soul, to say, I feel you, but I do not become you. I see your wound, but I do not hold it within me. I offer presence, not possession. This, I believe, is the deeper aim, not to absorb the other, but to witness them. For there is no greater tragedy for the empath than to become invisible to themselves. So deeply fused with the pain of others, they forget their own reflection. There are empaths who merge so deeply with the suffering of others that their own soul fades into a whisper. And this forgetting of the selfhood happens quietly every day. It happens in marriages where one partner silently carries the emotional weight of the other like an unpaid servant. It happens in families where the most sensitive child unconsciously becomes the emotional regulator for the entire household. It happens in therapists, teachers, and ministers who mistake overfunctioning for love, who confuse compassion with codependence. But this confusion is not harmless, it is not personal, it is archetypal possession. When the empath has not anchored their soul through inner work, they are easily absorbed by the wounded healer archetype, what the ancients called Chiron. And when Chiron rises in the psyche unexamined, it whispers a dangerous myth that your pain is your purpose, that your suffering makes you worthy. And so, the empath begins to believe they were meant to hurt, that their value is measured by how much pain they can hold for others. But this is a distortion, a deep shadow of the healer complex, one where identity becomes entangled not with the transformative pain of growth, but with the endless reenactment of unconscious servitude to other people's wound. And in this, the empath loses their sovereignty, not because they are kind, but because the archetype has taken the reins. You must understand archetypes are not symbols. They are living patterns of psychic energy, older than any culture, older than myth. So when you feel a pull to rescue, when you feel drained simply by entering a room, when you feel euphoric because someone needs you, pause, ask, is this truly me, or is something older moving through me? The archetype of the savior, the martyr, the eternal mother, the seducer, these can all slip into the unconscious empath, animating them like a puppet on spiritual strings. But puppets do not awaken. Puppets perform. To become whole, the empath must step into the sacred, dangerous act of separation. Not separation from love, but from entanglement. Not separation from presence, but from fusion. This is not coldness. This is warmth with a spine. It is to stand beside another's anguish and say, I will not abandon you, but I will not bleed for you. It is to feel the tidal wave of someone's unspoken grief and still declare, I will sit with you, but I will not become the ocean. A dream arises in my mind, one shared by a patient. In it, a forest ancient and thick with roots stretches through time. At its center, a deep stone well. Around it, empaths, men and women, kneel with hands cupped over their hearts, weeping. Inside the well are the shadows of those they love. They lean over, crying, hoping that if they care enough, weep enough, suffer enough, they might lift those shadows into the light, but the well has no end. And their tears only feed it. This is what happens when empathy becomes compulsive. It nourishes the very darkness it longs to dissolve. And here lies a truth few are brave enough to speak. Not everyone wants to heal. Not every soul is ready to awaken, and the empath who mistakes their gift for obligation will spend a lifetime trying to pull the unwilling from the depth. Solely to be pulled down with them, you must learn discernment. Ask, does my empathy liberate, or does it entrap? Does it honor another's path, or try to reroute it according to my fear? Even healing can become control, when it arises from the terror that someone might stay broken. There are parents whose empathy becomes suffocation, lovers whose sensitivity becomes manipulation, friends whose compassion hides a deep need to be irreplaceable. This is the shadow side of empathy. Where care becomes currency, where feeling becomes power, you may recoil, not me. But if you are truly empathic, then turn that gaze inward. Ask, where has my gift become a mask? Where do I confuse connection with obligation? Where have I made myself essential to others so I never have to be alone with myself? This is not shame. This is the work of integration. True empathy is not taking on another's pain. It is the art of witnessing that pain without losing your center. It is standing in the fire of someone else's suffering and remaining unburned, not by being detached, but by being rooted. And what is this root? It is the self, not an idea, not a persona, but the totality of who you are, your instincts, your history, your shadow, your future, your soul. The self is the axis around which the archetypes orbit, like planets around the sun. When the empath finds this center, they cease to be porous, they become anchored, and from that anchor true compassion flows, not as sacrifice, but as strength. But this path is not gentle, it demands descent. The empath must travel downward into the underworld of their own psyche. They must meet the parts of themselves that need to be needed, that merge to survive, that confuse intimacy with entrapment. These are not flaws, they are survival strategies, wounds from long ago. I have worked with many empaths whose gifts were not born of spirit, but of trauma. A girl who learned to read her father's mood like scripture, because his rage came without warning. A boy who became a court jester for his mother's depression, believing that if he could make her smile she might stay. They became empaths not because of enlightenment, but because of necessity, and that necessity carved into them a hyper-vigilance they would later call a gift. But a gift rooted in fear must be purified. You must ask, who was I before the world taught me to feel for others first? What part of me still believes that love must hurt? What would happen if I stopped absorbing the pain around me? Who would I be, and would I still be loved? These are not abstract questions. They are initiatory thresholds, and this is where the true test begins, to feel and still remain whole, to open your heart and keep your spine. To love without bleeding, to help without hollowing, to witness the world's suffering and not be defined by it. This is not detachment, it is mastery. Let me share one final image, though more are waiting. A woman stands before a fire, in her hands a bowl, around her a storm rages, voices crying out, winds tearing through the sky, visions of pain and injustice swirling like smoke, but she does not tremble. She lowers the bowl to the earth, in it, her own tears, she kneels, she whispers, not to the storm but to herself, I feel you, but I am not you. And in that moment the storm begins to still, not because she absorbed it, but because she stopped resisting her own sovereignty. This is the true empath, not a sponge, but a vessel, not a martyr, but a mystic, not a savior, but a mirror. Individuation is not a concept. It is a crucible, a sacred fire through which the soul must pass if it ever wishes to remember who it truly is. It is not about becoming something new, but becoming what you've always been beneath the masks, the trauma, the inherited grief. It is the unfolding of the self, the return to your center, the birth of the soul into its own skin. And for the empath, individuation begins with a reckoning, not with others, but with the parts of themselves they have exiled in their holy devotion to everyone else's pain. They must descend, not into another's grief, but into their own forgotten chambers. They must kneel at the altar of their rage and ask, "What are you trying to teach me?" They must sit beside their grief and ask, "What have you been hiding beneath your sorrow?" They must turn toward their wounds, not to romanticize them, but to understand how they've become addicted to being the broken one. And more courageously still, they must ask, what part of me has become addicted to rescuing the broken in others? This work is not kind, it is not pretty. It does not flatter the ego that wears compassion like a crown. It rips the mask of nobility from the empath's face and reveals what lies beneath, wounds disguised as worth. Love tangled with survival, a yearning to be needed louder than the soul's whisper to be known. Individuation demands that the empath stop bleeding on altars never built for them. It asks them to do something radical, to let others feel their own pain. Make no mistake, conscious empathy is holy, but unconscious empathy, that is energetic collapse. It is psychic contamination. It is the soul flooding with residue that was never meant to be housed within it. And that residue often runs deeper than any of us realize. For many empaths, sensitivity is not just a personality trait. It is an inheritance, passed down through generations like a silver bowl too sacred to discard, but too heavy to carry without breaking. A woman whose great-grandmother once served as the village seer may feel overwhelmed in crowds, her body remembering rituals she's never performed. A man whose ancestors were burned for their wisdom may bury his intuition under layers of emotional excess, terrified that clear sight will once again lead to exile. Ancestral grief lives in the body, and if the empath does not awaken to it, they will become its echo chamber, another vessel, another sorrow carrier, another unknowing continuation of the pain that came before them. Dreams do not lie about this. I have seen the dreams of empaths, dreams drenched in archetypal fire, snakes coiled around the heart, oceans swallowing children, ancestral homes in flames, while the dreamer weeps with no water to quench it. These are not personal images. They are the voice of the deep psyche. They say, you are overfull with what is not yours. One woman, a gifted artist, came to me with a recurring dream. She walked through an old museum, its halls filled with statues, frozen likenesses of her parents, her lovers, her mentors. Each statue bore a plaque, "Do not touch, property of the dead," and yet in every dream she reached out, and they bled. She thought this was punishment, but I told her it was instruction. Her empathy had become necromancy, constantly reaching into the past, resurrecting pain that belonged to others, to other lifetimes, to ghosts who never asked to be touched. She did not need less feeling, she needed more discernment. Some suffering is sacred to witness, and some is sacred to bury. Unconscious empaths become grave, keepers for the collective, wandering the psychic battlefield, mistaking every wounded soldier for a soul they must rescue. But not all pain is here to be healed. Some pain seeks extinction, and to interfere with that is not compassion. It is arrogance. To meddle in someone else's unconscious journey, to try and transmute what was never yours to carry, is to play God in a theater of archetypes you do not yet understand. So what's the answer? Do we harden our hearts, become numb, turn our backs on the hurting to preserve our own peace? No, we refine our empathy. We transmute it from sponge to sword. We move from emotional absorption to soul witnessing. From martyrdom to mysticism. The true empath is not fragile. The true empath is initiated. They have sat with their shadow. They have spoken with their rage, danced with their shame, held their terror in trembling hands. And because of this, they no longer confuse empathy with entanglement. They can feel without falling. They can witness without absorbing. They can love without losing themselves. And from this place of sovereignty, their gift becomes what it was always meant to be, not a burden, but a lamp. They light the way, not by bleeding, but by being whole. They guide, not by saving, but by seeing. They remind the world not of its wounds, but of its worth. They understand that it was never their job to carry everyone. It was their calling to carry themselves with such radical integrity that the world remembers how to carry itself. This is the true threshold, not into despair, but into transfiguration. Everything that has been unearthed in the cave of the inner world now demands only one thing, not admiration, not explanation, but embodiment. The empath who has done this work does not emerge as a broken healer, endlessly leaking compassion. They emerge as something far rarer, an initiated presence, a living vessel of the self. They no longer confuse absorption with love. They no longer perform emotional labor to feel valuable. They understand that empathy is not adoption. It is alchemy. It is the sacred fire through which suffering is seen, but not claimed. Witnessed, but not worn, felt, but not fused with. When the conscious empath enters a room, they do not scan for pain to fix. They walk as a mirror, not one that reflects wounds, but one that reflects essence. They become what I call the wounded mystic, not because they continue to bleed, but because their scars now speak. Their scars tell the story of someone who entered the underworld and returned with soul wisdom. But beware, as the empath becomes empowered, a new archetype stirs, the magician, the one who knows how energy moves, the one who can feel another's shadow without flinching, the one who has walked through illusion and returned with sight. But if the magician is not anchored in humility, they become dangerous. They believe they are above suffering. They mistake insight for superiority. They begin to manipulate with empathy to turn presence into power. And so the cycle repeats, this time cloaked in spiritual language, this time with cleaner robes and darker shadows. That is why the initiated empath must remain vigilant. Every day ask, is this mine? Am I feeling or fusing? Am I healing or controlling? Am I present or performing? These are not questions of doubt. They are signs of awakening. The conscious empath no longer fears uncertainty. They no longer rush to soothe discomfort. They allow silence. They allow others to be broken without immediately becoming their bandage. They trust the intelligence of the psyche. They know that pain is often not the enemy, but the doorway, and in relationships. Everything changes. The unconscious empath is drawn to the broken, the chaotic, the narcissistic, not because they are foolish, but because they are searching for redemption through pain, because a part of them still believes that love must be earned. But the conscious empath, they no longer crave chaos. They crave clarity. They are drawn to those who see them, not just need them. They build bonds rooted not in trauma, but in truth. And when loneliness comes, they do not fill it with ghosts. They sit with it. They listen. They let silence become sacred again. It is here, in this stillness, that the empath reclaims their deepest gift, not as a receptor of pain, but as a revealer of essence. They no longer dim their light to make others comfortable. They no longer bend their boundaries to be loved. They understand now that saying no is not rejection. It is devotion to the sacred within. I once had a dream. A silver lake stretched infinitely before me, its waters still as glass. Along its banks stood the many I had known, patients, students, even myself at different ages. Each one looked into the lake, searching for answers. And at the lake's center stood a single figure, unmoving, untouched by wind or ripple. They spoke no words, but when each person looked into their eyes, they didn't see their wounds. They saw what they might become. This, I believe, is the destiny of the awakened empath, not to be a mirror for pain, but a mirror for potential, not to walk the world as a martyr, but as a reminder to feel, not everything, but only what is true, to carry not the suffering of the world, but the vibration of integrity. In doing so, they do not abandon their sensitivity. They sanctify it. They do not run from the ghosts. They walk among them and remain unhaunted. They do not bleed to prove their love. They love without needing to bleed. They do not drown in the ocean of the collective. They become the shoreline where clarity begins. This is the work. This is the fire. This is what it means to be an empath, not consumed by